So I'll talk about the big iconic animals and the challenges we face in conserving them. So in the talk today, I'll be talking about some of the global challenges that we face that have particularly manifested after 2016, and also how they play out in conservation. I've tried to understand what some of the drivers of these challenges are, and I'll be talking a little bit about that. And then, as Peter said, what I think in this challenging space we as scientists and thought leaders can do to have good science as part of the solution moving forward. So, who in this room is feeling really positive about the state of the world and the direction we're moving in? Not many people. Oh, Hubert, great, the eternal optimist. But yes, there's a lot of negativity around at the moment, around the environmental issues and global societal issues and how we're going to try and deal with them. And so there is unfortunately a lot of negativity. And we are now, certainly post-2016, living in an era of populism, resurgent nationalism, polarization, and political tribalism. And at the same time, we're living in a fast-changing global geopolitical environment with new players coming into landscapes in continents like Africa. We see almost another scramble for Africa, China, Russia, and investing in the continent, and the US trying to counter-invest. And at the same time, our institutions of global governance are in trouble. The United Nations, the Climate Change Convention, the most powerful country, pulled out. International Whaling Commission, Japan pulled out. So these institutions are not working very well, and they are in trouble, and there's some people that are concerned about, well, how long are they going to last? And considering that a lot of the environmental movement is built on these global institutions, things are moved through the IUCN, through the UN, this is a challenge. So populism and post-truth politics, these are concepts and issues that are spoken about a lot at the moment. What does this mean? This means debates are largely framed by appeals to emotion and identity, and the science around and details of policy on high-profile issues are of secondary or little importance. It's about what is emotive and what resonates. False facts are reported and used, and science is therefore really challenged. So certainly when I entered my career as a scientist and did my PhD, it was to a large extent motivated by the knowledge deficit hypothesis, which is our problem in terms of good policy making and good societal decisions is we do not have enough knowledge. And if we do good science in a rigorous and robust way, we can get better knowledge, and then we can get to better policy. But now if we're living in a world where on many issues science is actually ignored and not seemingly what our leaders or what society wants to make decisions, what does that mean for us? So I was thinking in my mind, how did we, and particularly how did established long-standing democratic societies like the United Kingdom and the United States get to the position that they're in? And so in doing some reading and research, I stumbled upon this book, Media and the Political Process, which I thought explained some of the dynamics and the underlying drivers better than many others. And I was so impressed by the book in terms of the insight I felt it gave me. I looked up the author, Eric Lowe, and he actually happens to be here at UQ in the School of Communications and Arts. So I'm definitely going to look him up to have a chat to him. But what the book explains is that there's very clearly a very strong relationship between the media, politicians, and the political process. And in the world today, politicians need to be celebrities, and policies need to be like celebrity causes. And images and the media around these individuals and the causes are very carefully managed. And simple, emotive, and sensationalist messages are favored over nuanced detail necessary often, or most of the time, for good policy making. And so in reading this book and trying to understand this and thinking about the space I work in conservation, I think to a fair extent, certainly in some conservation issues, these sorts of same dynamics play out in conservation. Now, just before I talk in more detail about that, there's two additional challenges that working in contexts like Africa or other low and middle income countries that are very important. One is increasing inequality. So when we talk about, say, lion conservation, increasingly there's a gap between the people living in nice mansions that look like that with tremendous amounts of wealth that have invest a lot of money into conservation and have a large voice over what policies are appropriate and what should be done, and the people who actually have their livestock taken by lions, who live more like that. And this poses a challenge. Also, and again, coming from Namibia and South Africa, trying to understand the tremendous challenges we face in my part of the world, the legacy of colonialism is, and I know often politicians in Africa use that as an excuse for their own bad practices, but it is a real issue. And well, certainly if you have the taking over of a continent by a number of outside powers that are extracting resources for their own benefit and subjugating local peoples for their own benefit, that has long-term consequences. And when that ended, which was around the 1960s, there's a lot of research out there to suggest that, well, actually the consequences certainly did not end, and some of the same practices in a softer way continue. So papers on the persistent effects of colonialism on corruption, and investigations on, well, Europe and its investments into Africa, to what extent are they achieving, really directed at environmental and social good versus directed at what's of importance to the donor. And these pose real challenges, and James, you would know, in Kenya as well. Therefore, people in countries like Botswana, like Kenya, stand up and be, well, who are we doing conservation for? What is this about? This is being imposed upon us like colonialism was. And that message does resonate with people in those countries, because there are aspects of the system that do operate in that way. So moving on to manifestations in conservation of these challenges in terms of sensationalist, high-profile media, populism, and then exacerbated by the particular challenges we face in Africa around colonialism and inequity. And so one example I'll talk about, trophy hunting debates. The country of Botswana and the ferocious debates over elephant hunting, or culling as some people in Botswana are calling for, which I assume many of you have seen in the media. The Convention of the Trade in Endangered Species, which I've been actively involved in. The Conference of the Parties just ended in Geneva last month. And then I'll touch briefly on Brazil's Amazon and Cerrado habitats, which I think is facing some of the same challenges. So starting with Botswana. So there it is. Martine, I know you've been there. Who else has been to Botswana? You haven't been there?
I'm going next week.
Oh, good. Well, April, couple of you. But it's most famous, I think, for the Okavango Delta in the north. And it's got by far more elephants than any other country in Africa. It's got 130,000. And these two gentlemen here, that's President or ex-President Khama on the left, and this is President Masisi on the right. Now, as I mentioned, Botswana has 130,000 elephants, so, and the numbers have been growing. And so there is concern about, well, what does this mean for the people of Botswana? And real concern about the numbers of people elephants are killing. And then also concern because ex-President Khama was in favor of hard measures for conservation. There was real concern about, well, excessive use of force against local people that entered national parks, and not sufficient attention to them receiving benefits. And when President Masisi came into power in 2018, one of the drives he pushed was, well, let's fix this, let's deal with excessive use of force and coercion in our conservation practices, and let's make sure some of the benefits, or that we get real benefits from conservation to the rural people who live with these animals. And if conservation can't deliver it, we actually need to look after our people. And so one of the things that President Masisi did was to change some legislation, or just actually impose legislation which forced, I think it was about the rangers in the Botswana national parks, and that they couldn't use military-grade rifles. They had to use, normal guns, not military-grade rifles. And then following that policy change, this report came out in the news, 87 elephants killed by poachers in Africa's last safe haven. This was towards the end of last year. And then, so now you'd think that's a fairly obvious thing to establish. Were 87 elephants killed in one go? But now, following that report, there was further investigation, and the Botswanan government went in and said, look, well, show us these 87 elephants. And then, well, the NGO and the person who reported them couldn't actually demonstrate where they were. And there was disagreement, well, when was that elephant actually killed? Did it die of natural causes? Was it poached? So increasing doubts around, well, were there actually 87 elephants poached? And that headline, as probably many of you remember, made, it was headlines, New York Times, BBC, around the world. But it seems as though this is an example of fake news playing out in conservation. Now, I was in Botswana in the Okavango Delta, or near there in Maun, facilitating a workshop in March. And I was asking my colleagues there, and I was like, well, what has been decided? Were those 87 elephants poached? Were they not poached? When were they poached? What's going on? There's still not agreement. So in terms of science and evidence to make decisions, if we cannot even agree whether nearly 100 elephants were poached and then take science-informed action, we're not in a good place in terms of managing conservation of these species. Also, one of the things President Masisi did is review the hunting ban, which President Khama instated in 2014. And that was instated because there was problems with elite capture in hunting and not enough benefits flowing to communities. And also because there was a feeling that, the feeling in response to that in Botswana was Khama sold out to outside conservation interests. He was an ambassador to Conservation International. He was, and there was a feeling, well, he cares more about conserving these animals for people outside in the United Kingdom, United States, than he does about Botswanans. So that was part of what Masisi reviewed. There was a committee that went around the country talking about, well, you guys, how do you feel about hunting? Should we reinstate it or not? And the decision was that it should be reinstated. And again, a massive outcry around in the media around the world. Conservationists alarmed as Botswana lifts ban on hunting. Botswana condemned for lifting ban on hunting. So then the Botswanan president responds, and Botswanan society responds, and now sort of resorting to some of the resurgent nationalism we're seeing, and saying it bamboozles me when people sit in the comfort of where they come from and lecture us about the management of species they don't have. And so on this debate, we're really not in a good place, in the sense that hunting as it was practiced before was probably not delivering the levels of benefits that it should have been to rural communities live with wildlife. There was a lot of elite capture. It wasn't nearly as well managed as it should have been. Then when it was banned, and there was nothing to put in place, even in places, or to compensate for that loss of income, even in places where it was working well, those communities then thought, well, now we're getting nothing from these animals. So now we may as well just poach them because we're not getting any benefit from them. And so, but the focus on, well, should we hunt or should we not hunt, and all the media and the fuss around that is not enabling us to really talk about the deeper issues. How do we set up benefits from these animals, and how do we set up the institution so that the benefits really flow to people in a meaningful and sustainable way? So the next example I'm going to talk about, the Conference of the Parties to CITES, and some of you would have heard me talk about this issue before, briefly. an introduction to CITES for those in the room that may be less familiar with it. It's the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. And Martine or others, correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand, it is the only legally binding international environmental agreement. If, or certainly of relevance to conservation, if CITES decides you're not allowed to sell this species of tree, then you have to enact laws within your own country that reflect that. Whereas the CBD, UNFCCC, a lot of these others, they're voluntary. You sign up to something, but you're not legally required to pass legislation in your own country which reflects it. So it came out into force in you're busy Googling that, to see if I'm right. Came into force in 1975 due to widespread concern about the unsustainable use of trade of wildlife. It aims to ensure that a species is not threatened by trade. So a lot of the rhetoric and the discussion around CITES now, I've spoken to people who thought, well, CITES is about stopping trade. But it's that wasn't how it was founded. It's about ensuring that a species is not threatened by trade. It's constituted to be based on science and evidence. There's 183 signatory countries, and each country present has a vote. And it's, in terms of its workings, very important are the two key appendices. So the species listed on Appendix 1 means that it's considered to be highly threatened by trade, and there's no trade of wild specimens, and there's very strict guidelines over captive bred specimens. A species listed on Appendix 2 means trade is allowed, but it has to be carefully monitored. So I was at the last CITES Conference of the Parties. This is in 2016 in Johannesburg. So a very formal, very state-like affair. And I was surprised and disappointed at the extent to which the focus at that convention, which must cost tens to hundreds of millions of dollars to pull together all these countries from around the world, is on elephants. About 50% of the time and energy seems to be spent on elephants. And then rhinos, lions, iconic species, get an incredible amount of focus. And so when there's discussion around things like elephants and ivory, this is what the hall looks like. Media's there, everyone's excited. And when they're talking about species that may be a lot more threatened by trade and actually in need of more serious concern, like maybe a species of laughing thrush or orchids, everyone disappears. Well, except for the people that are relevant to that discussion, but the media disappears, the public attention isn't there. So CITES, this is how I and many people feel about CITES. It's as one of the earlier global environmental conventions or agreements, it's missing a lot of thinking and conceptual development that's come after that. So there's no attention to the importance of good governance, that people that are affected by a decision should have a voice in that decision. It does not account for local community rights and benefits. I've put in, together with the IUCN, a motion to try and address that, and there's slow discussion in that direction. Importantly, there's no mechanism for compensating countries who want to trade their wildlife products but are voted down. So Zimbabwe, for example, they've got 80,000 elephants. They've got serious governance issues, which is a big part of their problem. But they feel that, well, we've got these 80,000 elephants. This is a global good. The world cares about these things. We've got all this ivory, and we need to sell the ivory to conserve the elephants. Then CITES says, no, well, we don't, that's too dangerous, and we don't like that idea. But then there's no mechanism to be, all right, but Zimbabwe, we understand you guys are looking after those elephants for us, so here's some sort of mechanism to compensate you for that, and for the fact that the world decided you can't sell that ivory. There's no mechanism for that. Very importantly, and that's what we captured in a paper in 2017, there's no consideration of the different values around wildlife. So the Southern African countries that come from a culture and a history of use of wildlife and use and market-based mechanisms to allocate ownership of wildlife to private landholders to communities. They have a particular value. It's okay. If the way to conserve elephants is to hand out ownership rights and to let people hunt them, and then you'll have more. There are other members of the global public that are concerned about elephants in other countries. The value and the feeling is very different. Elephants are sacred. That shouldn't be something that you can own and hunt. And there's no consideration of those different values and no process to incorporate them. CITES, and we got a paper out with an honor student in South Africa in 2017 that demonstrate the levels of resentment that it generates, where farmers or landholders with rhino in South Africa are saying, well, CITES is kind of the conservation enemy because it's stopping us to benefiting from our animals. And as I mentioned, highly given a little attention. So a colleague of mine, Jacob Phelps, he works on orchids. Orchids are highly traded wildlife products, and he proposed to the CITES Standing Committee based on his research. He found orchids, Appendix 1 listed, critically endangered orchids, on trade in the open in markets in Thailand. And these orchids are restricted to one mountain, and this trade is clearly they're very threatened by trade, much more so than elephants are. And he suggested to the CITES Standing Committee, look, I propose that we have a serious discussion about how we elevate this issue. And they said, no, we're too busy talking about ivory. Sorry, there's no space in the agenda. So from a conservation perspective, there's a problem with that institution. And one of the other key and I think perverse outcomes in the way CITES is operating now, listing of a species in Appendix 1, which means no trade is allowed, is seen and communicated as a conservation victory in its own right. So there's a lot of NGOs campaigning around CITES to support, give us money so that we can uphold the ban on ivory or uplist otters, and then that is communicated as a conservation win when the species is listed. And coming back to the way the media plays out in this, and also the complex dynamics of these lower income countries, where often outside money from organizations like NGOs is your biggest source of conservation revenue, or certainly a very important source. So now organizations are saying that will give us money to conserve the species in Southeast Asia or in Africa, and we're going to conserve it by having it listed to Appendix 1. And if we get it listed to Appendix 1, that is a conservation win. But then, and that makes for good media, because we've banned this thing, that it's a simple message, it's definable, you can see you won the vote or you didn't, but actually then there's no there's very little investigation. Well, what did that actually work? If you listed these vulnerable otters to Appendix 1, was there any impact? What is the enforcement like? If their local farmers are there, or rural farmers are the main threat, is there any mechanism to benefit them? So all of that is missed. And as has been documented in a number of papers, the role of science is therefore weakened in CITES, even though it's meant to be science-based, because there's this whole dynamic around getting things listed onto Appendix 1 and upholding or maintaining bans. And talking to Simon Stewart, who was the previous chair of the Species Survival Commission, and Vivek Menon, who's been on the Indian delegation to CITES for many years, they said, well, even as so Simon was telling the story where when they wanted to move the red listing of a polar bear from endangered to vulnerable, I think, the Canadian government wrote to the IUCN and said, we don't like this, because you're making what we have, our polar bear, which is special because it's endangered, now you're saying you're sort of downgrading it. And Vivek was saying, well, in CITES issues, if they've got species of interest, so let's say a mountain zebra, and if they're seen to be on the delegation and that CITES conference of the parties decides that, well, there's now enough mountain zebra, they're doing well enough, we can have some trade, that's seen as a loss to actually move from Appendix 1 to Appendix 2. So there's a perverse dynamic operating here. in the sense that when we're actually succeeding in conservation and getting more of these animals and we can actually use them, it's seen as a loss and interpreted as a loss. So yet again, this is a global governance system in trouble. So at the end of the last CITES, or the one that just ended in August, there was a lot of discussion, and countries and stakeholders that were opposed to use of wildlife, especially around iconic species, were celebrating they've saved these species. And the Southern African Development Community countries, which is Botswana, Congo, Swaziland, now Eswatini, Lesotho, Mozambique, Namibia, South Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Tanzania. And considering that CITES spends so much of its time focused on elephants, rhinos, lions, and these countries collectively have over 80% of Africa's elephants, over 90% of the rhino, and the majority of the lions. This statement from the official statement from this community, I think, suggests that this institution is in trouble and we need to start looking to something else. So they're saying they're expressing grave concern. They're very uncomfortable with the levels of polarization around African charismatic large mammals. And they feel that CITES undermines the rights of people living in rural areas of southern African states to have access to and sustainable use of natural resources, and that they're required to do to enjoy adequate living conditions and the right to participate in the management of their resources. They feel that CITES is currently operating contrary to its founding principles. Today, CITES discards proven working conservation models in favor of ideologically anti-use models, and these are largely driven by non-state actors who have no experience with responsibility for ownership of wildlife resources. And they ended off, this is at the end of the COP that ended in August, that they're seriously considering whether there are any meaningful benefits from our membership to this convention. Now, Southern African countries club together and well, this convention's not working for us. And they find an East Asian country that wants some of these wildlife resources that agrees with them. Then I think that's a serious breakdown in our global environmental governance. And we're getting closer to that potentially happening. Because I feel that these species of interest, and that's what CITES is about, these are species that are of global public interest. They're a global public good. And importantly, the type of oversight necessary for conservation, and if you were to have any sustainable use, would be important coming from international players, and that would be removed if these countries decide that this system is working so badly, we're just going to leave the convention. So those are the challenges around iconic wildlife in Africa. So what do I think might be a way forward for science in this populist post-truth era? So I think what's really important, and I wrote a piece in The Conversation together with Matt just around the end of the CITES COP, is that we need to really get away from these debates. We need to reframe the debate. The African elephants, for example, are facing a big series of challenges in coming decades: population growth, climate change, scarce resources, and whether we trade ivory or not is kind of just a small issue in that, and we need to start talking about the real issues. And we need to frame the conversation so that we establish a new objective that is shared in some way. We need to have a process to engage stakeholders with different values, beliefs, and mental models, different ways of thinking about how the world works. So a Namibian conservationist feels, well, the way conservation works is I can sell my ivory, that brings me money, I pay to the community, they want more elephants, therefore we have more elephants and conservation works. Stakeholders in Kenya might feel that, well, if you sell ivory, that makes ivory more desirable, and then there's more poaching. You need to have a process to discuss those different mental models and bring evidence into that to decide on the way forward. And importantly, you need to have an agreed upon way about how information is collected in a way that is considered credible. And that was this paper that Martine, Matt, and James, and many others here was on. And this was drawing on the insights from my participation in the last CITES conference of the parties and suggesting an iterative process to try and break the deadlock on ivory. And I think there's potentially increasing interest in actually implementing something like this because the deadlock's continuing and getting worse. And briefly, this process, it's not rocket science. It's similar to adaptive management, structured decision making. The steps are reconfirm objectives. Importantly, and I think this is what's adding, what's different and novel from this, or in this framework as opposed to some other ones, is elicit and share the mental models and associated values around possible actions, evaluate and synthesize evidence and identify gaps and how they will be addressed in an agreed upon way, and then discuss trade-offs and what we can do moving forward. So following that paper in 2017 in Science, I then contacted the Secretary General of CITES, numerous other players in the conservation space to say, well, look, let's take this beyond just a paper and implement a process like this, because this deadlock on ivory is clearly really bad for conservation and bad for collaboration in conservation. And the feeling was, well, look, that's too contentious and high profile. We're not going to be able to do that. Why don't you do it, but start on something smaller and something where there's likely to be more buy-in. So I spoke with various people and in the global policy space, and the feeling was, well, for this type of thing, to try and implement it, place-based interventions are more likely to work, in the sense that there is really physical common ground. We're talking about the Okavango Delta. It's a place. At least we share that. Now we're going to talk about what the different options are to maintain its conservation. Importantly as well, and this Tim Seelig pointed it out in his talk last week, one needs to find a framing and an entry point that is politically feasible, that aligns with prevailing powerful narratives. Because hunting and sustainable use of iconic wildlife is seen as so revolting by many in the world, that's not a framing that's going to get you moving. So we spoke about, well, what is a framing that draws into play some of these issues that we can work with? And our decision was to focus on human-wildlife conflict as the entry point, because it's the conflicts and the costs of living with these animals, and the elephants destroying people's farms, the lions killing their cattle, that generates a lot of this resentment that then you see reflected in fora like CITES. And I managed to get some seed funding from the Luke Hoffman Institute to start this, with support from UN Environment and working closely as well with the IUCN, and focused on Namibia. Now, briefly, in Namibia, they're following the end of South African rule in 1990 and independence. There was the establishment of over 100 now community conservancies in the old communal lands. And they were, yes, they've got their challenges, but by and large they've been very successful. Elephant numbers have trebled, but this means there's more and more conflict between animals like elephants and people. So this was an image taken earlier this year. Namibia is currently in a terrible drought, the worst in a century, although the worst in living memory, they say. And so this is an elephant that's broken into a lodge where we were having dinner and trying to get to the food store there. The quality's not great because it's taken on a mobile. But so now this lodge, and these lodges have partnership agreements with the communities that whose land they're on, so that they share some of their revenue. So the lodge obviously loves the elephant being there. The tourists like it. They're likely to report positively. They'll get more clientele. But now, only a few kilometers away lives the farmer, low income. And if the elephant comes in and destroys their only source of food, that's a very different feeling. And so there's conflict around this, and around how we should manage this. In Namibia as well, there's the emergence of groups who feel that, well, you shouldn't be hunting an elephant if it's a problem animal is wrong. And then, as some of you would have seen in the media, it wasn't this elephant, but another one in the same area was declared a problem elephant and then put out on trophy hunting, on a trophy hunting permit, and I think raised $10,000 or $20,000, and some of that money goes back to the communities. And there was a huge outcry about that. But is that an appropriate management action? So we're we've started with a series of workshops and running through this process. And so this is a pilot initiative, and working with the WWF, who are really pushing better and more coordinated and higher profile action on on human-wildlife conflict, and also the IUCN. They've got a new task force led by Alexander Zimmerman on human-wildlife conflict. What we're aiming to do over the next 5 years is develop an accepted standard for deep dialogue and mediations for conflicts that stem from human-wildlife conflict, and therefore, the conflicts around what are the costs of conservation. Because currently in many of the environments I work in, low-income parts of the world, this is not happening. And the resentment builds up and builds up until it reaches a breaking point, and then there's a reaction by government like we currently have in Brazil, where they're just, well, conservation is not of interest. So this process is obviously very policy-oriented, and it centers a lot around building partnerships and getting the right partners and stakeholders on board and getting the right people in the room. But what I'm trying to do is to really build research and good research into it as far as possible. And so I have a number of PhD students and other research partners feeding into this. So Hubert's standing there. He's not working on the Namibia project directly, but the rhino issue is a huge issue at CITES. I was in conversation recently with the rhino specialist group, and Hubert's work on what are the possible responses through a choice experiment in terms of, well, shall we have a legal trade of horn, shall we have synthetic horns, or shall we maintain the ban in the trade of horn, is of great interest to them. So hopefully Hubert will be presenting to them in the next year or so as to the results of his PhD and inform some of the thinking around, well, what we should do about the rhino poaching crisis. Abigail Brown is looking at value orientations and also choice preferences associated with what actions are acceptable around human-wildlife conflict management, and doing that in Namibia and also across wealthy countries and poorer countries. So South Africa and Namibia, and then looking at wealthy countries like the US and the UK, and how do people feel about what's acceptable, what are the values related to that. Agrippa, who's I've worked with, he didn't get a scholarship, so he's not a PhD with our group yet, but he's looking at relationships between attitudes to conservation and benefits received in Zimbabwe at Wangi National Park, and now started recently, and he's looking at evaluating mediation and facilitation mechanisms for conservation conflicts. So getting near the end now, and I did say I'd talk about Brazil, and as Peter mentioned, when I was still here, I was leading the UQ component of a project looking at the soy supply chain and understanding, and the component I was leading was understanding the different mental models people have around how the supply chain works and how we can get to reduce deforestation and greater sustainability. And Angela Guerrero, who many of you know, she was the postdoc on that. And now we have a PhD student, Rafaela, who's starting very soon, or in the next month or so, to actually continue this work. And interesting, in my meetings in Brazil and coming from Angela's work, some of the same issues come out. It's not iconic wildlife, but these are iconic habitats. The Amazon, iconic habitat. Brazil's forests and wild areas, iconic places. And what we had in some of those meetings, and Brazil's complex because you've got the Brazilian farmers who are quite wealthy, and then you've got the indigenous groups, which, as I understand, are rather disenfranchised. And so we weren't talking that much to the indigenous groups, focused more on the farmers, and they were feeling that, well, this is really unfair, that countries like the United States are telling us we can't clear our Cerrado or our Amazon so we can plant soy and get wealthy like they did decades ago, and yet they're not compensating us. And actually, if you look at levels of deforestation, they're deforesting more than we are. So there's a real sort of feeling of resentment and battle over, well, who actually owns this, the Amazon, the Cerrado? And so when Bolsonaro, the current president, speaks of the colonial mindset in terms of the response to the Amazon fires, farmers that I've spoken to and that we interviewed that are pro-conservation, they would feel that is supporting them because of they're not anti-conservation, but they really don't like the feeling that they're being trampled on by some sort of global common good without due process and compensation. So to conclude positively, in the post-truth era of populism and identity politics, understanding different values and perceptions is critical. And I should add to that, there's a lot of research, including some in the School of Business here at UQ, that emphasizes the importance of the messenger. So if one of us goes into rural Queensland and talks about, well, actually land clearing might not be such a good idea, that's, even though we present exactly the same information as person B, who's from there, and considered as one of them, it will be received completely differently. And that's something else we need to think about, is who is the messenger around these issues. We need to develop processes to contribute to policy and decision making in partnership with key actors that incorporates diverse cultural values and identities. And although the breaking down of things like CITES, the International Whaling Commission, etc., are challenging and make us feel negative, they are actually real opportunities, because those mechanisms in many ways were not working particularly well anyway. And we have a real opportunity now to inform how they're going to be adapted or what will follow next. And a key issue here, both within countries and between countries, is the challenge of growing inequity and injustice, and this exacerbates polarization. So I'm looking forward to questions. If anyone is interested in collaboration or working with our group, we do have some funding available, PhD, postdoc level potentially. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Duan. Do you want to field your own questions, or does anyone like to do?
I'm happy to field questions.
Natalie.
Thanks, Duan. That was great. So, do you think CITES is going to be resolved, or do you think that group of South African countries will be able to make some changes that still exist, but sort of updates, or what do you think will happen with that?
I think it's unclear. I think it's a moving space, and because it's so high profile, it's very related to geopolitical issues.
Because if it does get resolved, and isn't perhaps going to send such a negative message, even if maybe it would need to be
absolutely, and that's the problem, and that's what in discussions with people in UNEP, which CITES sits under, that's the feeling, because of the dynamics that have emerged. It's making important stakeholders in the process feel that the process is really failing for them. And so it would be a disaster if a whole bunch of countries left. But that means that the process as it's currently operating needs to be reformed. But there's a lot of drivers and vested interests, etc., that are keeping systemic issues that are keeping the process where it is. So I think that's we don't know what's going to happen, but I think that's why it's an exciting time, in the sense of let's prepare the science, let's prepare the examples of what could be done to be done better, and then both within possible reform CITES as well as something that replaces it. I mean, a scenario that could play out quite easily is the geopolitical tension between the US and China escalates. CITES is seen to be by many countries in the non-Western world to be Western driven. So, and then I could see the Southern African countries and China being as a sort of a geopolitical statement, well, we're leaving this collectively and we're just going to do our own thing and trade what we want to, which would be a complete disaster, because Zimbabwe trading directly to China is not necessarily, I don't think the governance will necessarily be the best. But collectively, the conservation community has allowed the dynamic to get to the level where that may happen, which is why we have a responsibility to deal with this. And I think the other thing that, and this is in terms of exciting opportunities, talking to some WWF people in Namibia, they're developing a system whereby you get direct payments for elephant presence into community guards with an app on a cell phone or mobile phone. They take a photo of an elephant in their area, it's geolocated, and that links to funders, people in San Francisco that want to pay for elephants directly. So there's no involvement, there's no giving $100 to Humane Society to conserve elephants. It's just direct payment for the presence of elephants. And we need, I think our role as scientists is to understand, well, what are the levels of payment that are probably needed? What are the mechanisms and institutions that need to be in place for that to work? Because these are, and with the technology we have now, these are tangible alternatives that could be put forward and kind of outflank or, you know, just get us around this mess which is outdated.
I really liked that talk, and I really liked the clear description of these problems, because it's sort of, yeah, it's very sort of satisfying to the framework for trying to get everyone on the same page and deal with these things. But that first step of getting people on the same page is what I've just been thinking through, because if you can get to the point of getting people to agree on a conservation objective, you know, then there's still this enormous amount of work ahead of you. But I just wonder whether we're just so many miles from that, because I don't think that most people engage with these issues. I mean, the general public who watches this actually are thinking about it from a conservation perspective anyway. It's a welfare or an animal rights thing that's driving them, and the values are a different category, right? I mean, I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that's what Simon Stewart mentioned to me when I suggested this to him. I said, currently the power is so much in the hands of the animal rightists and animal welfare movement that they're not going to want to come to the table to engage in a process like this, because it will weaken their position. But so that's, again, if SADC countries walk out of CITES, then that changes the dynamics. And that then the world would be, then that creates a space for mainstream NGOs to then be, all right, well, this is a disaster, now let's enact a process like this. And so you do need the right political circumstance for people to even come together. And I think that's why a lot of it is about framing. And so I think no one, and that's what we wrote in the conversation as well, no one disagrees with the framing that we want these things conserved. No one disagrees with the framing that you need to deliver benefits and rights to the people, lower income communities that live with them. No one disagrees with that. But what the current framing of the problem and the mechanism for debate is leading to, it's not leading to actually talking about how we deal with those issues. It's focused on one specific thing, which is ivory. And so I think through a reframing, there is potential to potentially get to that. But yes, one has to also be, I went on a conflict transformation course in the States by Francine Madden, who's led a lot of the very high profile contentious issues, for example, around wolf introduction in the US, where there's an incredible amount of tension around whether you should do it. And her frame is you're always playing three-dimensional chess, meaning you're always being strategic on these things. You have to see who's where, who's got what position, and then be ready to suggest a process to deal with that. And I don't think people, certainly animal rights and animal welfare people, don't want to be seen to be walking over the rights and the livelihoods of rural communities in Africa. So if that's brought out and a constructive alternative is suggested, I think people would be open to it.
I think that wolf thing's a really good example, though. I mean, the fact is that not everybody agrees that conserving these things is a good idea, including in Africa. Not everybody agrees. In fact, lots of people really hate elephants there and would be quite happy if they went away forever. So it's not, I mean, isn't that that assumption that everybody agrees that we should do conservation, exactly that problem you're talking about, that perception that that's a Western ideal that's being foisted upon us, you know?
I think it's, and with our project in Namibia, we had interviews and in-depth discussions with a wide range of stakeholders, including farmers and representatives from the Ministry of Agriculture, and they were, elephants are nice. Actually there's a lot of cultural heritage around elephants in those communities. But what those people do not like is the fact that they feel they're valued less than elephants, and that the costs imposed by elephants has no mechanism of dealing with it. So I think, and that's our process there, is to surface these things. And so it's about reframing the conversation space. And yes, they're on the extreme, they don't want elephants. But if you could suggest a more constructive way in which farmers that want to farm could still farm, but you still have elephants, then I think there's a lot of middle ground to move forward from, which the current framing of the debates is not getting us to. It's polarizing sides.
So going off that, what would be the catastrophic outcomes if South African countries left CITES and were left to manage their own species?
Well,
if the people that live there want to conserve them and manage them effectively.
Well, I think I read an interesting piece recently suggesting that the collapse of global governance institutions is perhaps a good thing, because all you need is principles that are agreed on and get actors in the system to get on with it. I think, as Natalie mentioned, a key problem would be symbolic. It would be yet another global environmental agreement that's falling apart. And I think my feeling is, because of, again, the legacy of colonialism and the corruption entrenched in those sorts of systems, if you've got Southern African countries dealing directly with China without any oversight, I think that could work potentially, but I think it would work better if you had an agreement and be like, all right, well, this is how the flow of the money from Ivory is going to work. This is how it will be monitored. This is how we're going to ensure that it doesn't end up in another mansion of another president, but rather to the communities that are living with elephants.
Isn't that a big part of the problem, though, that they're saying, is that other countries are telling them what to do with their wildlife?
Yeah, well, that's where, and I think that a lot of these issues, the same with the Amazon, there's a real battle over ownership here, because these resources, be they forest or wildlife, are within a country. The country feels they're theirs. CITES effectively says this is a global public good. The world owns this, not you. And there's not a good system to, like, there's pressure to have within a country like Australia around benefit flows to farmers who are farming in a way that's more aligned with conservation. Those mechanisms do not exist. So part of this and a part of these discussions is talking about that ownership issue. And I think another part of this that came out out of our discussions in Namibia was that these farmers are really feeling that they having to put up with these elephants. This is a service to the world, yet they're getting no reward for it. The world attacks them when an elephant is shot that may have killed 5 people in the village already. But the world doesn't praise them because they're looking after these animals. And so these are all things that should come out. And I think there are mechanisms to deal with them.
Yeah, on an international scale.
Well, and linking across scale. So in governance, Lynn Ostrom speak, a multi-level system.
Yeah.
But it does need real discussion to get, the fact that so many scientists and countries and NGOs are spending their time fighting about whether you should sell ivory or not, to me, is a real failure.
Okay, we're a little past the hour now, so let's thank Duan again for really great work.